relationship between human creativity, the kind that produces a miraculous computer like this, and the kind of creativity that we usually associate with that term creativity, which is, I think often the image we get of creativity is the artist in the garret producing something like this, producing a painting, and it may be beautiful, may be very aesthetically satisfying, but it's not too practical. Well, it wasn't long ago. It was about the early 1950s. As a matter of fact, right here is one of the reports that came out of the Utah conferences in the early 50s. It was only then, 100 years after people started really thinking about the human mind, that creativity started to be investigated. And what we want to do in this I want you to think for a minute about your own experience from age 5 forward. What was it that happened to you? Carry with us from about age 5 forward a kind of internal censor, a sort of hypercritic. What we do is we judge our ideas while we're thinking about them. And it turns out that that doesn't work very well. Alex Osborne, who was the father of the term brainstorming, said once that using judgment while you're trying to think up ideas is like driving with one foot on the accelerator and one foot down on the brake at the same time. You don't get very far, and the machine isn't helped very much with that kind of behavior. The secret is very simple, and that is that it turns out that there are two kinds of thinking, it turns out, in the human mind. One is something that we call divergence. And you know psychology, it has to come up with terms to explain these phenomena. And the other one is called convergent. And simply said, divergence is the exercise of imagination. And convergence is the exercise of evaluation, selecting among the alternatives that imagination produces. This is exactly what happens in nature. In nature, with the trilobites that we talked about earlier, 600 million years ago, there were many, 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 many alternatives. And over time, those got weeded out. And little by little, they combined into just a few forms, so that out of a huge variety of forms that were available at the time, we now have just a few. And we find them in shrimp and lobster and horseshoe crabs and things like that. But that enormous initial diversity was divergence at work in the natural world. And it turns out that when we're dealing with ideas and solving problems and inventing and innovating, we're doing exactly the same thing that nature does in evolution. What the secret is to separate these two kinds of thinking and not combine them. To begin working on any kind of a problem or an issue or an opportunity with divergent thinking, imagining all of the possible alternatives. Now, one of the things that's really neat about this is that when you're using creativity at the highest level with imagination, quantity produces quality. The more ideas you produce, in the end, the better they get. And think about that just for a moment. Why might a lot of ideas, and I think Linus Pauling, who is one of those very few people who has earned 2 Nobel laureates in his lifetime, capsulized it very simply. He says, if you want to have a great idea, have lots of ideas. It's very simple. We have to release the 5-year-old that doesn't have that internal critic working, the internal judge, the censor, and release our minds to be playful and produce many, many, many alternatives. And as a matter of fact, what we find out when we compare the statistics from the divergent mutations of evolution and how many finally end up working out, you have first these mutations and then natural selection. winnows those down to just a few. Well, we have divergence at work and then convergence. And this is the key, to really let yourself go, to produce many, many, many different ideas that can combine, that can mutate in the mind and produce A here and B here. It produces C here later on, which turns out to be the final survivor, and wouldn't have occurred if the crazy kinds of mutations like a B didn't come along. So we have to, the peculiar thing about nature and the peculiar thing about human creativity is that in order to be working at the very highest level of problem-solving ability, we have to be crazy. We have to let all of the craziness out. We have to be a stenographer to our brains and just let everything out, do kind of automatic writing. And the important thing is that we practice both of these. We don't, I'm sure you know people who are very divergent who don't have very good judgment, and you know what happens to them. And there are also people that I'm sure you know that are converging all the time and never, ever have a new idea. And we have special places for them as well. Many of them running some of our largest institutions. And I'm not talking about the institutions for the insane and infirm. The important thing is to have both, to spread out with both, to be highly skilled in the area of convergence and divergence, to have a balance so that we have high divergence, we also have high convergence. We also have real decision-making skills that help us sort out many, many different. As you go on in these sessions, what you're going to discover is some new kinds of decision-making techniques as well that are pretty exciting in sorting out things when you have some very complex situations to look at. And today, our world is getting very complex, and we need new kinds of tools to deal with what's going on around us. But the real start is to open up, to really follow new kinds of rules when you're starting to produce ideas. It's the kind of rules that produces those wonderful masks that are behind me that you find in primitive societies. They don't know any better. They have, and if you're not seeing a bunch of crazy stuff come out while you're doing this, then know that you haven't really let yourself go. So one measure of imagination is to look at your list and say, just how much of this is absolutely crazy, is irrelevant, maybe even completely irreverent. You want plenty of that. In mutations, well over 90% of the alternatives that nature tries don't work. And it's the same thing with ideas. We just have to let out as many